Hello and welcome to another Left Book Club event. Tonight we're going to be discussing Jason Hickel's The Divide, a brief guide to global inequality and its solutions, with some great guests all under one virtual roof. So we're really happy to have you all join us. My name's Becca. I'm doing a bit of guest hosting this evening. I'm a researcher and campaigner, mostly focusing on criminal justice issues. Just a little bit about Left Book Club for those of you who aren't familiar. The Left Book Club is a subscription book club and not-for-profit initiative. They publish collectible editions of radical and progressive books, which are uniquely available to members, and they're posted out to you each month. They seek to foster a spirit of collective learning and political education, and they aim to create spaces and avenues where people can learn from each other and discuss radical ideas that inform actions and practical steps, with the goal of supporting the struggles fighting for us all. Left Book Club events have featured some phenomenal speakers over the past month, so please feel free to check out the video library on YouTube for discussions engaging with a wide range of radical thought. And tonight, please don't forget to ask your questions in the YouTube live stream chat. We've got some great tech support on hand who will be making sure that your questions are passed over to me and I can put them to our speakers. If you would like to become a member of the Left Book Club, please visit leftbookclub.com and click Become a Member. Alternatively, you can start by subscribing just to the mailing list to get some further updates, and the links for all of this are in the description of the YouTube live stream. Don't forget to follow Left Book Club on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook to keep up to date with events, promotion and giveaways, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel while you're watching with us tonight. If the stream goes choppy at any point, please just bear with us. We have got tech support on hand and we'll make sure to continue running as soon as possible, but it's very unlikely that that will happen. So on to tonight's event. We're joined by author Jason Hickel and senior lecturer Rob Knox, our other guest, for a discussion on The Divide. This is Jason Hickel's book, which is a provocative, urgent, and ultimately uplifting account of how the world works and how it can change for the better. The discussion will explore the reality that poor countries are poor because they're integrated into the global economic system on unequal terms, and that aid only helps to hide this reality. So we've got two speakers for you. We've got the author himself, Dr. Jason Hickel, who is an economic anthropologist, author, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He's a visiting senior fellow at the International Inequalities Institute at the LSE and professor at the Institute for Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. He's an associate editor of the journal World Development and serves on the Statistical Advisory Panel for the UN Human Development Report 2020, the advisory board of the Green New Deal for Europe, and the Harvard-Lancet Commission on Reparations and Redistributive Justice. Jason's research focuses on global inequality, political economy, post-development, and ecological economics, which are the subjects of his two most recent books, The Divide, which we're discussing tonight, and his latest book, Less is More: How Degrowth Will Save the World, which was published last year. Our other guest is Robert Knox, a senior lecturer in law at the School of Law and Social Justice at the University of Liverpool. Rob is also an editor of Historical Materialism, Research in Critical Marxist Theory, and the London Review of International Law. His research analyses the interconnections between imperialism, processes of racialization, and international institutions. So with all of that information out there, what we're going to do this evening is just an opening short presentation from each of our speakers. We then have some questions that us at Left Book Club have thought up to ask each of them to delve a little bit further into the issues thrown up by the book and the discussion. And then we're going to take a few rounds of questions and comments from everybody watching at home. So again, don't forget to drop those questions and comments in the YouTube live chat and we will pick them up from you. So just to kick us off, I'd like to invite Jason to start and introduce us.
All right, thanks very much, Becca. And it's really good to be with you all. I hope that I'm coming through clearly enough, but if not, just let me know. Okay, cool. I'm actually most looking forward to hearing what Rob has to say tonight, but so I'll try to get through my bit quickly. So the book sets out to address a series of sort of prickly questions about global inequality. I should say before I get going that my thinking on some of this has actually advanced a little bit since the book was published. And maybe we'll get into that in the discussion, but I'll try to just give a brief overview right now of kind of the main arguments of the book and a few other bits here. So some of the questions that, that the book seeks to grapple with are like, basically what explains the extreme disparities that so obviously exist between rich countries and poor countries today, right? So like, how did Britain and a few other European and North American countries become so rich, and why has the rest of the world not achieved that same trajectory? Right, so these are, obviously big questions that virtually everyone at some point has thought about in their lives as they kind of look at the world around them. Now, the book is sort of directed at questioning what I guess is kind of the dominant narrative on these questions, and that's basically that global inequality can be explained by the fact of each country's kind of internal conditions. Okay, so basically countries that have good institutions and a strong work ethic and so on manage to progress through the so-called stages of developments. Well, those that don't, basically fail to do so, right? So this is kind of W.W. Rostow's theory from the 1960s, which is still basically with us today. So when we see this very clearly in our school textbooks, where the story is effectively that Europe had the steam engine and the flying shuttle, and this generated efficient mass production of goods, which triggered the Industrial Revolution, and living standards rise, and everyone's happy, as if all of this just kind of emerged spontaneously from within Europe's borders, right? So this narrative is obviously, deeply ahistorical and apolitical, meaning that it ignores actual history. And it ignores power relations in the global economy over the past several centuries. So by focusing only on the internal conditions of countries, it obscures 500 years of interactions between Europe and the rest of the world, interactions which were violent and deeply inequitable. Okay. So in reality, the story of Europe's industrial rise and the story of capitalism more broadly is, of course, much more troubling than the one we're familiar with, although probably not in this book club. And of course, it's impossible to cover it all, but let me just offer a couple of key points here. So the first key observation is simply that capitalism obviously requires a mass of cheap, exploitable labor, right? And so this doesn't exist sort of automatically or naturally. It was achieved in Europe in the 16th century and onward through the process of enclosure. Whereby there was sort of this widespread dispossession of peasants, destruction of subsistence economies, and effectively generated a mass refugee crisis in Europe, and particularly in England, which generated kind of the proletarian labor force that fueled the factories of the Industrial Revolution, right? That's how you get this massive cheap labor. And that story is sort of familiar to most, I guess, progressive historians in Europe, but what I think falls out of this picture a little bit is the fact that the rise of capitalism in Europe also depended fundamentally on colonialism, and this was happening at exactly the same time as the enclosures. We often think of them as kind of separate movements, but in fact they're part of the same kind of historical moments, really happening at the same time. So you're, for example, I mean, of course, we know that the Americas were brutally colonized beginning in the late 15th century, just as the enclosures in Europe were expanding. So this process of elite accumulation was happening, globally. So Europe's rise, for instance, depended heavily on silver, which of course was extracted from the Americas. Between the years 1500 and 1800, something like 100 million kilograms of silver were extracted from the Andes and shipped to Europe. Now, just to put that figure in perspective, that would be worth about 165 trillion US dollars today, which is twice the size of the global economy, of the global annual output of the economy. This silver was crucial in the sense that it provided much of the capital for the Industrial Revolution. It also allowed Europe to build up its military capacity, which enabled further rounds of enclosure and dispossession and colonization abroad. And possibly most crucially, it allowed Europe to buy agricultural goods from the East, right? So most of the silver that was extracted from the Andes and shipped to Europe was actually ended up in the hands of Eastern merchants, in exchange for agricultural goods, which liberated Europe to basically shift its workforce away from agricultural production towards industrial production, right? Cotton, another key raw material of the Industrial Revolution, doesn't grow in Europe, right? Doesn't emerge spontaneously from England's fair shores. It was grown on land stolen from indigenous Americans, grown with the labor of enslaved Africans on a mass scale, okay? Just to give you a sense for the scale of unpaid labor appropriated from Africans, in North America alone, during just the period from 1600 to 1865, the mass of labor that was extracted, if paid at the US minimum wage, would be worth around $100 trillion today. Of course, there are different estimates for this, some higher, some lower. But that, again, is more than the total output of today's global economy, right? Sugar is another key one. It was an important source of cheap calories for Europe, which, again, allowed Europe to shift labor from agriculture to industrial production, okay? So an ecological windfall derived from the lands and bodies of people in the global South, again, through mass enslavements, okay? So in other words, I mean, sort of basically in sum, capitalism in Europe's industrial rise depended on processes of dispossession, colonization, appropriation, and mass enslavements, right? It also depended on forcibly deindustrializing parts of the global South in order to destroy indigenous industries that were competitive with European industries, to create captive markets for European goods, right? Like once you have the system of mass production in Europe, you have to have an outlet for all the goods you're overproducing. And that means doing something about India and China in particular, which were industrial powerhouses at the time, okay? So, you know, colonization was used to impose unequal treaties on India. The Opium Wars were used to dismantle China's competitiveness, impose unequal treaties there. The effect being that indigenous industries were effectively destroyed. And these regions were made to be sort of importers of Western manufacturing output and exporters of cheap labor and raw materials into the world economy. Okay, so I mean that's sort of colonialism in a nutshell, if you will. But the story that I think is sort of more interesting is what happens at the end of the colonial period, and in the middle of the 20th century. And I say end of colonial period, recognizing that several parts of the globe are still colonized by European settlers. But also in the middle of the 20th century, we have sort of the US backing away from direct military interventions in Latin America, at least for a time, giving a foothold to progressive governments in the region. So during this period, we have newly independent governments in global South countries uniting around progressive economic ideas and rolling out what we call developmentalist reforms, okay? In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, this really was a kind of miracle of sort of global South economic progress, I guess. They were using policies like land reform, okay, to shift land away from colonial holdings to, you know, back to dispossessed communities and small-scale farmers. They were improving workers' wages and improving labor rights and so on, legalizing unions, which were barred under colonial control. They were investing in public services, right, like universal healthcare and education. They were nationalizing key resources like oil and various other minerals and agricultural products. They were protecting their domestic industries with trade tariffs and subsidies, which allowed them to build sovereign industrial capacity to supply their domestic needs as well as to compete with the global North, okay, effectively. All of this was addressing the real causes of colonial underdevelopments, and it was working really remarkably well. During this period, per capita income was growing in the global South at 3.2% per year, okay? That's an extraordinary rate, faster than what the West achieved during their own industrial revolution. Not only that, but they were uniting with each other in the form of the non-aligned movements, right? Which in 1973 put forward this extraordinarily ambitious and progressive document to the United Nations General Assembly and got it passed by a landslide, and was called the New International Economic Order. And effectively, this was sort of the height of progressive third worldism. It established the right of global South countries to pursue their own economic interests nationally without worrying about Western intervention, okay? Of course, Western powers were upset by this shift, this post-colonial shift in economic policy in the South, precisely because it was cutting off their access to cheap resources and raw materials that they enjoyed so prodigiously under colonialism. And so they began to intervene against this movement in the form of coups that worked to effectively topple progressive leaders across the global South and replace them with, in most cases, right-wing dictatorships or military juntas that were more amenable to Western economic interests. And this is clear, from, beginning from 1953 with a coup against Mossadegh in Iran, then with Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, Arbenz in Guatemala, Obote in Uganda. Patrice Lumumba was deposed and assassinated in the Congo in 1961. Sukarno in Indonesia. Of course, everyone knows Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. Former French colonial powers, France intervened in its former colonies in West Africa in the post-colonial era through a secretive network known as France Afrique, where they basically rigged elections and installed their preferred leaders, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, the legacy of intervention in the post-colonial era was brutal and expansive. But these interventions were piecemeal, and the real blow to the progressive movement actually came a little bit later in 1980 with what's known as the Volcker shock. The Volcker shock, basically the US Federal Reserve jacked up interest rates in order to tackle domestic inflation problems. But this caused a debt crisis in the global South where debts are denominated in US dollars, triggering what was known at the time as the third world debt crisis, okay? The IMF and the World Bank intervened in order to prevent defaults, which would have hurt Wall Street. And they intervened by imposing structural adjustment programs across global South countries. Structural adjustment programs, or SAPs, were basically a three-part cocktail of aggressive neoliberal economic policy. Privatized public resources and public services, cuts to social spending on healthcare and education, and public employments, liberalized trade by cutting tariffs, cutting subsidies, cutting capital controls, cutting protections on labor and the environment. Pretty much all of the policies that global South countries had been using so successfully during the progressive era were dismantled, were reversed under structural adjustments. The movement was destroyed in basically one fell swoop. And I like to think of this as a kind of coup, although without the direct military intervention that accompanied the bloodier coups of earlier decades. A coup in the sense of control over economic policy in global South countries was shifted from parliaments in those countries themselves, national parliaments, to technocrats and bankers in Wall Street, in New York, Washington, and London, right? Washington being, of course, where the IMF and World Bank are headquartered. The consequences of structural adjustment were brutal in terms of the impact they had on global South countries. Of course, I mean, during this period, incomes collapsed and did not recover for around 2 decades. The 80s and 90s are effectively lost decades in the global South. 1.2 billion people were added to the ranks of the global poor during this period. I mean, when you think about what has generated extreme global inequality in the contemporary period, structural adjustment is sort of the key answer here. Of course, it rescued the global North from its crisis of stagnation in the late 1970s and enables them to sort of reestablish profits and growth by reaching into kind of to new markets and re-cheapening labor and raw materials and so on. So it was great for the North, massively destructive for the global South. And of course, this is possible because these institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, are deeply inequitable institutions. They're deeply anti-democratic. They were formed during the colonial period. And to this day, the former colonial powers retain control over them. The US has veto power over all major decisions. The G7 and the European Union control well over half of the votes. The global South, which has the majority of the world's population, has a minority share in these key institutions that control economic decision-making in the global economy, okay? Something similar is true of the World Trade Organization, into which global South countries were integrated during and after structural adjustments. In the WTO, bargaining power depends on market size. And so the countries that grew rich during the colonial period, therefore, get to determine the rules of international trade effectively in their own interests, right? So inequality sort of begets inequality through this institution. One thing I didn't really discuss much on the divide, which I'd like to just devote a few minutes to here, is the fact that one of the main consequences of structural adjustments was the fact that it again cheapens the prices of labor and resources in the global South vis-a-vis the North. Now, this is and this was happening at the same time as the North was shifting industrial production, offshoring it to the global South, where industrial capacity was now being mobilized not to meet Southern needs, but rather to service Northern economies, okay? So the price inequalities that were stimulated by structural adjustments led to a process of what we call unequal exchange, which is the dominant feature of the global economy today, okay? When you have price inequalities, what that means is for every unit of labor and resources that the South imports from the North, then in order to pay for that, they have to export many more units in return. So this generates a kind of net flow of labor and resources embodied in traded goods through international trade and global commodity chains, right? This is sort of obvious if you just look around you at like where all of the stuff that is in global North economies actually gets produced and where the resources come from. Just look around you and give that some thought. But this has been demonstrated empirically in recent years. A study that came out earlier this year by by Christian Dorninger and his colleagues sort of illustrates the scale of this net appropriation from the South. I'll just give you some kind of headline figures here. Each year, and this data is from 2015, there's a net flow of 10 billion tons of raw materials and 23 exajoules of embodied energy, 800 million hectares of embodied lands. Okay, that's twice the size of India. 200 million person years of embodied labor. That's twice Latin America's total workforce. I mean, an extraordinary amounts of labor and resources in the global South is organized entirely around servicing Northern consumerism and elite accumulation, when it could be used to meet human needs. Okay, so just to give you a sense for that, that quantity of land that I just mentioned could be used to provide nutritious food for more than 4 billion people, but instead is used to produce things like sugar for Coca-Cola and beef for McDonald's consumed in the global North. Okay, that amount of energy I mentioned could provide electricity for 1.5 billion people in the global South, which is the population of Africa, the entire population of Africa. Also powering infrastructure for public healthcare, education, transportation, internet for everyone, but instead is used to power SUVs in Europe, right? This is what I'm talking about. So basically, I mean, as a consequence of this arrangement of the world economy, this raises serious questions about the dominant narrative of catch-up developments. We have this idea, and any economist will tell you that the global South just has to develop and will eventually catch up to rich countries with the same level of income and consumption. Global South economists, beginning with Samir Amin and even before him, pointed out that catch-up development is fundamentally impossible in a world economy that is organized around imperialist appropriation, right? So assuming that poor countries will just catch up to rich countries within such an economy is like saying that if Amazon workers just work hard enough, they'll eventually catch up to Jeff Bezos, right? Which is obviously ridiculous. So we have to understand that the divergent trajectories of income in the global North and the global South, and the persistence of mass poverty in the global South, where 4.2 billion people still don't have enough income to meet basic needs. This is not due to countries being somehow behind in their development or on different development trajectories or having bad internal conditions. This is a function of imperialism. Okay, this is what an imperialist world economy looks like. And of course, this reveals the dominant discourse about aid to be fundamentally in error. Okay, we have this notion that rich countries sort of, having achieved their wealth autonomously, now give of their benevolence give of their surplus benevolently to poor countries. This narrative grants them the moral high grounds and makes sort of the takers of the world economy seem like givers, when in reality, clearly there's a net flow from south to north. And it's not just a net flow in terms of resources, but also a net flow in terms of finance as well, right? There was a recent report published by Global Financial Integrity that found that for every dollar of aid that the South receives, they lose $24 in net outflows to the North. And that's mostly through processes of tax evasion by multinational corporations and other illicit financial outflows, trade misinvoicing, abusive transfer pricing, and so on. I mean, to the tune of trillions of dollars. So all of this makes it clear, effectively what Walter Rodney and others were saying decades ago, which is that poor countries are developing rich countries, not the other way around. Or rather, you might say that poor countries are being exploited for the sake of development in rich countries. So I'm just going to close by talking a bit about solutions or responses to this. So in the divide, I propose, okay, I have kind of this chapter devoted to solutions, and I, well, I'll tell you what it's about first, and I'll tell you why it's a problem. But it's basically devoted to like, I'm speaking to the development industry, okay, the development sector. I'm trying to convince people that we need to shift from a paradigm of charity to a paradigm of justice, focusing on not on aid, but rather on addressing the structural causes of global inequality and unequal development. And I paint a picture of like what kinds of policies would enable kind of a fair global economy to emerge. And I call for cancellation of debts to liberate global South countries to spend their resources on domestic development, as well as to liberate them from remote control power by creditors. I call for the democratization of global economic governance institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, specifically in order to allow poor countries to use tariffs and subsidies and other mechanisms that they used so effectively during the progressive era in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I call for tax justice to put an end to tax evasion and illicit financial flows. A global minimum wage to ensure that there's kind of a floor on the race to the bottom for cheap labor, on the grounds that, look, if we're going to have a kind of globalized capitalist economy, then it stands to reason that we should have globalized labor protections, given that this is a single world economy. And then, of course, climate reparations to cover the massive climate damages that's being caused by excess consumption in the global north and excess energy use. Okay, I stand by all of these claims, but my sense now, being a bit more mature, I suppose, and I guess, maybe, is that really none of this is realistic, in the sense of there's not going to be a sort of benevolence shift in global economic policy, not even one that's generated by social movements in the global north. It's not really okay to sort of propose that the South should just kind of wait around to be decolonized in kind of a technocratic way. So I think that what we need to be focusing on here is like, what can themselves to take steps towards unilateral decolonization. And I think that it's from MMT economists in the global South offer really interesting possibilities. What they propose is that we can, and this is again drawn from MMT, is that we can issue the national currency, at least in cases where governments have control over the national currency, where they have a sovereign national currency, to fund three urgent projects. First, universal public services. We can print the national currency to fund universal healthcare, education, public transportation, etc. Food sovereignty and energy sovereignty. Food sovereignty specifically with regenerative farming, and energy sovereignty with a shift towards renewables to reduce imports of fossil fuels. Both of these approaches reduce your reliance on imports and finance from the global north. Finally, third, you can issue the national currency to fund a universal public job guarantee to mobilize labor, or domestic labor around these objectives, and at the same time end unemployment, right? This would have these policies alone would have a dramatic impact in terms of ending poverty and improving livelihoods by mobilizing domestic resources and labor around meeting local human needs rather than around servicing northern economies. So what you do is you cut the North off from their capacity to exploit you through trade and finance, right? Now, of course, we can't be naive. To the extent that this is prohibited by creditors, this requires defaulting on external debts. And this is something that is best done in groups, right? Like single nations defaulting are more vulnerable than nations defaulting in concert. And so there are ways we can think about a kind of collective debt default that forces northern creditors to the table on the terms of the global south, okay? And then finally, of course, just unilaterally using tariffs and subsidies to build sovereign economic capacity to meet national needs, which of course might incur the wrath of northern trading partners. But because we're using MMT to reduce our dependence on northern trade in the first place and shifting to south-south trade where possible, this becomes less of an issue. So this is not to say there would not be difficulties along the way, but it would be a successful trajectory towards achieving economic sovereignty in the 21st century. And these are not new ideas, although they're emerging again across the global south. But I want to again point to Samir Amin, who is a big influence for me and really kind of the key instrumental figure behind some of this thinking. So that's where I want to leave it for now. And sorry for going a couple minutes over, but I look forward to what Rob has to say and to the conversation that follows. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jason. I know, having recently finished the book, I don't know how you've managed to so comprehensively cover so many parts of it in a short period of time. So thank you so much for that overview. Yeah, I'd like to invite Rob for his presentation.
Well, thanks, Jason. That was incredibly comprehensive. And Becca said earlier that the book ends on a kind of an uplifting and inspiring note. And my plan was to bring that down a little bit. I kind of feel like Jason's already done that with his step back from his big solutions, but I'll still put my oar in about that. So obviously the book is like a properly magisterial account, which kind of covers this broad swath of things. And it does this really important thing of both denaturalizing poverty through the idea of historicizing it. And that's a politically really important task for the reasons that, Jason's already identified. Like, we live in a world in which we think of poverty as natural when Jeff Bezos is going into space on his own. This is a bizarre kind of counterposition that we're having right now, but we still have that. It makes it kind of a difficult book to respond to in a way, because presumably everyone will be a bit bored by me just nodding and going, yeah, good point, good point, good point. And equally me going, but the world isn't unequal, would be probably relatively unconvincing. So, I mean, a lot of people have read the book and, probably from hearing Jason talk about it, you'll be thinking you should read it, and you definitely should if you haven't. But putting aside my broad swath of agreement with what Jason says, and it's kind of, and a lot of the work that I do on international law and international institutions draws on his work and work similar to it. There are a couple of things that I want to flag up as perhaps areas of slight divergence, which maybe help us think through something a little bit differently, and then return back to this question of what it is that you can do or we can do about international poverty, with the proviso that Jason has now revised his conclusions on that. So if I'm attacking a shadow, but we can still have a little talk about that, I think. So I firstly want to talk a little bit about the kind of middle period that Jason was talking about, this kind of moment of global South developmentalism, and just throw up a couple of questions. And I want to connect that a little bit to some of the discussion that he has in the book about Keynesianism and the relationship between kind of developmentalism in the global South and Keynesianism in the global North, and think about how that relates to the nature of capitalism. And then just finally, I want to pick up on what I think is a really important part of the story that Jason brings, which is this question of law and institutions as really central to the production of poverty, which is something that a lot of people don't focus on sufficiently, I think. And as a person who researches law, it's kind of really useful to hear someone talk about that. So the first thing I want to engage in is a tiny bit of left-wing sectarianism, because it wouldn't be a left-wing event without some small left-wing sectarianism. And just to say, the first thing that I tend to do when I get a book electronically is I do Control F, and I do Control F Marx, and then I do Control F my own name because I'm a narcissist. But it's the Marx thing that's the most important thing. It's just like my dogmatism shining through. Now, Marx is definitely in Jason's story, but I think to some degree, one of the things I'm quite interested in a sense, and which kind of comes into this story of the politics of the global South, is the role of initially the Russian Revolution and then the existence of the Soviet bloc and what that does in the context of the Cold War and how that opens up a space for developmentalism. That's one thing. And secondly, the involvement of the communist movement, both kind of internationally, but also, if you like, indigenously within national liberation and global South projects. And this is something that I felt, for me, when I was reading this, I was like, oh, well, this feels like a part of the story which could be here for important reasons. So I think the clear thing that Jason has already kind of flagged up is that you get in the 50s and 60s this global South developmentalism, perhaps most encapsulated in the context of Bandung, where you get this kind of very politically heterogeneous third world coalition, which establishes basically a series of quite minimal standards, which kind of form a core of non-interventionist, non-aligned third worldism. And it's really important to say that that is an incredibly heterogeneous coalition, ranging from like China and the Chinese Communist Party to like relatively right-wing former British colonies, which just don't want to have any truck with anything. So one thing that I think would be interesting to bring into the story almost immediately is the degree to which, in various ways, the radicalism of the Russian Revolution in its initial wave was actually quite instrumental in forcing imperial powers to give a little bit more leeway to the growing anti-colonial movements, and the degree to which the Russian Revolution contributed to the language and practices of the initial articulation of the anti-imperialist and anti-colonial movements. So just one important thing, right, is that what happens is that when the European Revolution doesn't arrive in Russia, the kind of anti-imperialism of the Russian Revolution takes on an even kind of more outsized thing. And the Bolsheviks reach out a lot to movements in the colonized world. They start bringing these people in. They have the Congress of the Peoples of the East. They have the Baku Conference, and they really center anti-imperialism in their program. And one of the things there's a very interesting observation about this, which is like the Bolsheviks were like the first people to bring not white people to speak in platforms in the European world. This is like the first time some people had even seen a Black person having a political opinion. So there's this significant thing that goes on here. But what's really crucial, and I think is important to this story, Jason mentions the unequal treaties. Well, the first state to repudiate unequal treaties are the Bolsheviks in the 1920s, when Trotsky goes into the diplomatic archives, rips up all the secret treaties, and he is like, well, these unequal treaties are done. So one of the big things that starts forcing the rest of the European powers to even start themselves thinking about repudiating these treaties is the Soviet experience and this threat that they have of an alliance between a kind of revolutionary movement in Europe and the anti-colonial movement. And there's a big fear about that. Like, it's not an accident that Wilson starts articulating this discourse of self-determination, almost in contradistinction to the Bolsheviks having their own vision of self-determination. Now, Wilson's vision, Woodrow Wilson, president of the US, is a conservative vision that's racialized, but it's a kind of response to that. Equally, during the period of developmentalism, the Soviet Union, for the many, many, many bad contradictions that it has, opens up a space for some of this to happen. So an interesting thing to think about in the context of something like the UN is that the state that puts the kind of motion, like the General Assembly resolution to like end colonialism onto the agenda, it's the USSR. They're the people that move it, they vote in favor of it. The Western powers all abstain on the vote, which is important. They don't vote against it, they abstain because they realize the jig is up. So part of what I wanted to just flag up here, just as a kind of background thing here, right, is the degree to which the space for the colonized world to do some of the stuff it does was dependent on this threat of an alliance between a radical state that was attempting to overturn, at least in the eyes of the kind of Western powers, everything, and those colonized powers. And part of that opens up this geopolitical space. And I think that's important as a political context for what could happen with developmentalism. The second thing that I think is important in this story, of course, is that, as I just mentioned in relation to Bandung, we probably to some degree want to disaggregate developmentalism. Developmentalism is a useful broad descriptor of a project, but it hides many different political movements, right? So we have more or less radical third world states involved in this period. And one crucial thing that Jason brings out to a degree, but I almost would like to bring out more, is that when you get to the NIEO, one of the things that Western powers did was to deliberately try and drive a wedge between your more radical states, such as Algeria, led by Boumediene, and somewhere like Singapore, and say, well, you guys can't be in a common project because you have very different political visions of what the NIEO accounts for. So I think, firstly, then my initial point is like, we wanted to some degree keep that in mind, both in terms of thinking about the political context of what happens and thinking about the composition of those movements. The reason that's important, I think, is that one of the really interesting things that Jason does in the book, and I think this is actually a really impressive thing that a lot of people haven't done, is look at how Keynesianism in the kind of advanced capitalist world was in some respects mirrored and related to the kind of Global South developmentalist project. And at the end of that developmentalist project in the Global South was a kind of trial run for ending Keynesianism in the advanced capitalist world. So again, drawing on the fact that there was this close interconnection between the production of poverty in the kind of Global South and what's going on in the Global North, that these two things are not the same. But one thing that I think is an interesting tension and would be interesting to see how that we would resolve this is, and this is a tension which is inherent in Keynesianism itself, to what degree is Keynesianism a project of technocrats to kind of rationalize capitalism? And to what degree is it the capitalist class being forced by the threat of social unrest to agree to certain kind of a certain form of social peace? Now, of course, it's both, but I think for me, especially in light of the kind of the broader threat of this alliance between the Russian Revolution and the Global South, that threat is what is very significant to enabling the class piece of Keynesianism to happen. So I think this is important because it sets the scene for the fact that a lot of the compromise, and it was a compromise in the Cold War period, is overlaid by this broader threat of political radicalization. It's overlaid by this idea of whatever. Like there's the great C.L.R. James quote, "The rich are only defeated when they're running for their lives," right? And this is kind of that kind of scenario. It's like, well, we don't want to run for our lives, so what we're going to do, we're going to compromise, we're going to compromise, we're going to compromise. So I think that overarching point is important because one thing that we ought to say, I think, and like I say, I suspect from Jason's kind of move away from his final chapter, we can see that he obviously knows this too. Keynesianism and these various forms of regulation of capitalism are in some senses fundamentally incompatible with the driving logic of capitalism. So one of the things that a lot of people have talked about recently, and I think they're correct, is that at the core of capitalism is this endless expansion of growth. And that's true. But I also think one of the things that is inherent in capitalism is what Marx called the anarchy of the market. It's this idea that social needs are never filled directly through capitalism. They are fulfilled because it will give someone a profit. Now, Keynesianism was an attempt to manage that whilst keeping private property intact, and it was fundamentally, on some level, unstable. And we see that because that class compromise breaks down, as Jason himself expertly outlines in the book. And it's not an accident, I think, in that context. My chair just went backwards all of a sudden. It hasn't gone backwards for ages. It's not an accident in that context that the crisis of third worldism coincides with the kind of the crisis of the USSR, right? That is not a pure accident. It is that model is discredited significantly, and the economic crisis of the USSR is not simply a kind of crisis in funding for the Global South. It is also a crisis in the conditions that kept the social peace around for the Global South to be able to do that. And I think that is significant. So all those things in mind then, I'm going to talk, I think I've got about 5 minutes and I won't go over, about law, because of course I am, because that's what I research and no one ever wants to talk about law, so give me a platform and I'm going to talk about law. And like I say, one of the very interesting things about this book, and I think really important, is that Jason shows that poverty is not just a kind of economic phenomenon. It's also a political and importantly, legal and juridical phenomenon. And in particular, what you see from this book is that neoliberalism specifically is a fundamentally kind of, at least as it takes its form, it's a fundamentally legalized regime of political economy. Organizations such as the IMF, the WTO, and the World Bank are organizations that are structured around rules very specifically, and they are specifically legalized. If we go domestic, we could also see this. Like if you look at domestically, one of the ways in which neoliberalism has been embedded is through attempting to legalize politics, to insulate it from popular contestation. So this is really important to me because it demonstrates that there is this close, and I'm going to go into this a little more detail, quite structural link between legalization, neoliberalism, and I would argue poverty. Now, what I want to do a little bit here is add an extra dimension to Jason's story on this, which I think helps us further see the problematic role of law within all of this. So Jason brings law into the picture, particularly in relation to neoliberalism. But what's interesting in the kind of international legal scholarship arena is that actually so many of the historical events that Jason describes are saturated in legal argument to begin with. So the dispossession of native peoples, unequal treaties, all of these things are mediated through international legal forms, which are controlled and devised by colonial powers and are specifically structured around ideas of, of dispossession. So you can have a law which articulates a particular standard and then is able to dispossess certain people, which enabled these forms of expansive accumulation to happen. And this is, and in fact, if we go back and look at structural adjustment, for instance, one of the really interesting parts of Jason's book is discussing the role of the US in its kind of periphery during the Monroe Doctrine, using debt as an instrument to justify invasions and stuff like that. But what's fascinating, and I have an article about this somewhere, is that this, in some sense, also begins or embeds the seed of what will become structural adjustment. So when the US occupies Haiti, the first thing it does is gets the Haitian government under the barrel of a gun to sign a treaty saying this isn't an occupation, they're just here to help us out with our debt. And what does the rest of that treaty does? The rest of that treaty puts the US general receiver, a kind of technocratic US official, in charge of Haitian customs revenue and the police and everything else. And it says the first thing you've got to do before you pay off anything else in Haiti is service the US debt, then pay the police who are staffed by the US, and then you can do what you want. So in a sense, this is perfectly anticipating the later model of structural adjustment, where it goes, well, look, you still have your nominal sovereignty, you've signed this agreement, but we are using that agreement. It is precisely through the exercise of your sovereignty, if you like, that you are dispossessing yourself of this kind of control. So right back in the kind of 1910s even, we see this connection between law and these kind of things. And part of the reason for this, right, is that aside from a kind of vulgar but true thing about powerful people controlling the law as a kind of social form has a deep set of connections with capitalism. And what that means very often is just two straightforward things. Law is a kind of elite kind of discourse and doctrine, which almost by definition is exclusionary for lots of people. And it tends to abstract things. Law is not very good at getting at kind of deeper structural or other causes. So when you articulate things through law, they become very amenable to, well, promoting capitalist outcomes. And indeed, and I'm just gonna have to hurry up a little bit here, but like indeed, one of the very interesting things about that, right, is that even things that can seem to be progressive when they get articulated through legal institutions can turn into their opposite. So again, one of the interesting things in Jason's book is that he talks about the way that international institutions have used the language of poverty reduction and have almost like fixed the statistics in a way to kind of be like, well, no one's poor because they, but the other interesting thing actually, and a thing that kind of international legal scholarship has shown, is that this mission of poverty reduction has often been the justification for further levels of intervention into the global south. So Balakrishnan Rajagopal in an excellent book kind of says, look, it's always been by invoking the poor southern masses that international institutions have expanded the legitimate sphere of what international institutions can go into. And he points to, for instance, the 1920s and the mandate system where they invoked the poverty of the kind of former colonies and saying, well, we've got to go in and help them. So even on this basic level of what could seem benign, it was a per se way of legitimating a range of interventions by international institutions, which, to be honest, by their very nature, are not friendly to these kind of political mobilizations. And just a final point on the law then is that the other thing that then is really interesting about this is that we tend to think in this context of sovereignty as being a good thing. We want to defend sovereignty. But legal sovereignty historically was actually one of the reasons that the new international economic order, which Jason mentioned, failed. Because if a state is sovereign, it can only be governed by rules to which it consents. And of course, you know who's not going to consent to the global south getting a range of regulatory powers and changing the world economy? The global north. And indeed, this is what happened. They had historically agreed or abstained on various General Assembly resolutions, which meant they could be seen as binding. But the moment that they began to say, well, no, this is not happening, the shift was to say, well, this is a political declaration. It's not a legal declaration. It doesn't have any legal force. And this completely defeated this kind of legislative program. So then just finally, taking all of this together to shadow attack Jason's older solutions, one of the things that Jason, I think, very compellingly argues, but I think, as he's acknowledged, ultimately contradictory, is that there are a series of reforms that we could make to international institutions about transparency, democracy, and fairness, which would eliminate poverty. But I think the crucial point is that to do this, it wouldn't just not be a small thing. It would literally mean rethinking the entire architecture of what sovereignty and international law meant. It would mean ripping up and turning over the entire history of international law. So what seems like a common sense thing is in fact a revolutionary thing. And then to come back to my beginning point, given that the only context in which we even got Keynesianism was in the context of a threat to the entire global order and the alliance of a kind of socialist movement with an anti-colonial movement, if we're going to do something as big as ripping up the entirety of sovereignty, there's going to have to be something like that alongside it. So the big question, I think, and the big answer to this in a sense is, and I don't think anyone would dissent from this, like I suspect ultimately building against poverty is by definition also not just building against neoliberalism, but building against capitalism and its whole set of presuppositions. And I'll just stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rob. I've got a couple of questions for myself and then also from our audience, but I just wondered, obviously, Jason, you said some of your thinking has changed since this book came out, and I just wanted to give you the opportunity, if there was anything that chimed with what Rob said that you wanted to come back on or add to, then please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you. That was really rich, Rob. And I agree with everything you said. So there's not much I really have to come back to, except to say that I think that the legacy of the USSR in this story is complicated in this. And I should say also, I didn't mention it very much. I didn't really deal with it much at all in the book. For various reasons, but the main thing here is that you're right that clearly the USSR created, like its very existence, to say nothing of its financial and military support, created space for the possibility of radical third world movements, right? On the other hand, to the extent that governments in the global south associated with the USSR, they made themselves increasingly vulnerable to attack and intervention by the USA and the UK in particular. And so the savviest global south governments found ways to basically adopt Marxist thoughts and radical progressive economic policy, Keynesianism and beyond, while at the same time sort of rhetorically distancing themselves from the USSR and from communism. So Costa Rica comes to mind as an example, right? Costa Rica, I mean, for various other complicated reasons, managed to avoid having their leftist government toppled by the US and avoided the worst impacts of structural adjustments. And today remains sort of this beacon of progressive, economics in the South, although even that is being eroded. So there's that. But I totally agree with you on the question of the very existence of the welfare state in the West is due to the anti-colonial struggle in the South. And this, I think, remarkably falls out of our discourse here in the global North. And it's not just that, but there's a very powerful discourse that says that capitalism is responsible for all of the gains in human welfare indicators, okay, that we've seen over the past century and a half or whatever, or a century. Now, this is crucial because when we understand that capitalism is in fact a 500-year historical project, and look at the data in that kind of context, what becomes clear is that the rise of capitalism everywhere it went was associated with declining welfare standards, declining social indicators. I mean, just think of the depopulation of the continent of Africa during the Atlantic slave trade. Think of the depopulation of the Americas during the genocide there. Right? I mean, we have very clear evidence from Asia of active impoverishment and income deflation under colonialism, et cetera. Like this process produced misery, and that is visible in the social indicators. And that's true also in England itself, where we see a decline in life expectancy during the rise of capitalism until the late 19th century. It's only then that we see improvements begin to happen. Why does that happen? It begins with progressive social movements in domestically, so the rise of the labor movements the democracy movements, etc. And also like the radical public health movement that brought in sanitation and, you know, early bits of the welfare state. But then crucially, the welfare state itself is only allowed, as you pointed out, because of the threats that global North workers might build alliances with the global South radical social movements that are basically Marxist, causing the capitalist enterprise in the global North to basically collapse, right? So these concessions are given to the global North in response to activism in the global South. We owe the welfare state to our brothers and sisters in the South who fought for it, right? So I mean, all of this to say is that we have this story that capitalism delivers improvements in social progress, when in fact, at every point, they're delivered rather by struggles fought by progressive social movements, both domestically and abroad. And I think that's such an important part of the story.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so we've got quite a few questions. I'm going to try and do them in pairs because there's ways in which a lot of them overlap. So I've got a couple of questions here, which I guess this dovetails quite well from the discussion that we've just been having. So one person has asked from our audience, if the global North is cut off, would it not simply find an excuse to use military/intelligence methods to recolonize the global South? And then kind of related to that, and whoever kind of wants to answer the question, you can answer both of them or separately. Somebody else has asked, can we regard any of the US-led sanctions against countries like Iran and Russia and criticism of China as economically motivated? How much of the pro-democratic rhetoric is really true? I will copy out those questions for us, but I don't know if Rob or Jason wants to start off with either of those. Jason, sorry, you're on.
Yeah, I spoke last, so Rob, if you want to jump in, then feel free, and I can go after you.
Okay, so firstly, if the global North is cut off, when it simply find an excuse to use the military intelligence methods to recolonize the South? And what about US-led sanctions and criticism of China? Can we understand this as economically motivated rather than pro-democracy?
So, I mean, on the first point, absolutely. Like, this is in Jason's book, but we know it more generally. This is the basic truth of how these things go, which is that, you know, military intervention in many, many respects serves as the handmaiden to and the safety valve of problems of capitalist accumulation. And should that happen, that's, you know, very likely to be what's going to happen. But I think we can then say a few things back in relation to that. The first thing is that signals what the political task of people in the global North is if they're serious about international solidarity. It's that is something that you will be in a position to try and stop. Like, part of the historical mission of the left in the advanced capitalist countries is to prevent their own capitalist states from doing this kind of thing. And there are long histories of that being more successful than other times. The second point is that these kind of things are not invulnerable. This is precisely the point, right? Like, the US has just withdrawn from Afghanistan, and I'm not saying that's like hooray, 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 but I am saying that what this does is it puts pay to a myth of the idea of the invulnerability of the imperial state's military to defeat. But of course, this is what is going to happen. But that is precisely why you have both solidarity in the global North and also South-South solidarity. Like, in terms of the rhetoric around sanctions, I think it's important to like separate out a few different things here, which is that I'm going to stay relatively agnostic on like what we want to say about democracy in the states that have been mentioned or not. I don't think that you have to endorse them to say that the rhetoric in terms of sanctions is very much rhetoric. And that's true for a number of reasons. Firstly, sanctions, if you are serious about promoting democracy, are literally the least useful thing that you can do. Sanctions hit populations, they don't hit states and governments. And the general effect of sanctions is to strengthen regimes that are already in power because they have greater control over resources coming into places or not. So this is like, if we then look at the historic pattern of how these sanctions have gone, it's very clear that there is more than a hint of economic stuff going on. The Russia stuff is interesting simply to contrast what the US does with what the rest of Europe does, where the rest of Europe, because it's dependent on Russia for gas supplies, is very hesitant to involve any kind of sanctions, when the US, seeing Russia as an emerging competitor, is keen to put those kind of things on. Similarly, like, it's not an accident that it's with the emergence of China as an economic competitor, but also something that is like important to the US economy broadly, that we see that articulation and the pivot. Now, again, that isn't to say that there aren't problems in the context of these places or what they're doing, but it is to say that sanctions would not be a serious way to address those problems in any case. And the coincidence of this with a broader set of economic interests is fairly straightforwardly clear. So yeah.
Yeah, I just want to jump in to add to that. Yeah, in terms of China, look, you don't have to agree with the Chinese government to recognize the fact that what troubles the U.S. in particular about China is that it's really one of the few regions in the world that has retained its commitment to developmentalist thoughts and its ability to do that, like its ability to sort of carry that out as well, right? Like they have resisted all attempts to crush that. And okay, so there's the East Asian. The Asian tigers, right, which have also done the same, but with sort of the go-ahead by Western institutions, basically. China has done it without the go-ahead. Now, what's interesting about the China situation is that this is bizarre, the way that this rhetoric about the rise of China and et cetera, et cetera. China's GDP per capita is less than 1/6 that of the USA, right? 1/6. And we have this rhetoric where, you know, if they develop any further, then we're just going to have to destroy. The USA is going to have to destroy them. This is kind of what's being spoken about, and this should reveal to us the fact that you know, any rhetoric about being pro-development in the global South is really a veil. I mean, what's effectively being spoken here by U.S. government officials is that China must always remain with a fraction of the GDP per capita of the USA, and never go beyond that, or otherwise risk military intervention. That should trouble all of us deeply, I think. To the question of if the North is cut off, what will the repercussions be? Look, I mean, this is a real risk. Thomas Sankara, to me, I mean, this is an amazing story, a deeply troubling one, but the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso in the 1980s recognized the extent to which debt was sort of this form of neo-colonial power in Africa. And he stood up in the halls of the African Union and spoke to his fellow heads of state and was like, look, we need to organize united debt resistance against our creditors to throw off this yoke of neo-colonial power. And he points out, look, I mean, if we default on our debts, nobody dies. If we do pay our debts, then we suffer and we die. So the moral choice here is very clear. Only a few months after, I mean, and I should say, I mean, this idea stimulated an incredible discussion among African heads of state, and there was sort of the stirrings of revolution in the air. This is during the early height of structural adjustment. Just a few months later, he was toppled in a French-backed coup and assassinated, right? And this served as kind of a warning to other global South leaders, like don't think that you can resist this mechanism of neo-colonial power. The consequences will be grave. Now, Sankara knew, and he said as much in his African Union speech. If he was to do it alone, he would die before the next year was over, right? He would be killed before the year was over. He said to his colleagues, if I do this in Burkina Faso alone, then I won't even be here at the next African Union meeting. If we do it all together, what can they do? They can't kill us all. That spirit, I think, is basically what we need to be able to recover in anti-colonial struggle, but also what Rob mentioned. It's essential that unions and progressive forces in the global North unite to prevent any kind of intervention along these lines. And I worry about the extent to which that's possible, because I don't see this actually, like I don't see unions in the global North caring much at all about internationalism. That is effectively dead. In the global South, there's real possibilities emerging, but we have to be clear-eyed about the fact that the political alignments of the NIEO era are not with us any longer, right? As precisely a consequence of the neoliberal onslaught. So we have some progressive governments in Latin America, parts of Asia and Southern Africa, but and maybe this movement will grow, but right now there's not the kind of unity of purpose that once defines the South as a bloc.
Thanks so much. I think going on from that, we have a couple of questions about kind of myth making and political education, which is obviously one of the kind of key reasons for Left Book Club's existence as well. So we have one question from a viewer that says, when we speak about decolonizing the curriculum, is it not then vital to highlight the issues raised tonight and demand an end to the myth building of empire and epistemic violence, time for anti-capitalist education? And I guess linked to that, a lot of times in the book, Jason, you speak about the kind of destroying of particular stories and myths, or the concocting of particular figures and stories and myths that uphold the idea of poor countries as being poor because of something going on internally. So I think related to what you were talking about that absence of kind of serious movements in the global north that demonstrate internationalism, I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about the relationship between this kind of myth-making, political education, and whether there is an opportunity for these movements to develop in the global north, or whether you don't see that happening.
Yeah, it's a good question. So yeah, in terms of the question of decolonizing curricula, like I'm on board with this idea, of course, in the sense of let's, in sort of the obvious sense of let's bring in global South thinkers who are speaking to these issues and make sure that people are exposed to them. Like the fact that people in British universities are not reading, in international developments and political economy departments are not reading, Samir Amin or Ndongo Sambasia or, Fadel Kaboub, et cetera. Like these are the thinkers we need to have, Vandana Shiva, et cetera. In our classrooms, that's essential. But I also want to recognize the fact that that we should avoid using decolonize as just a metaphor, recognizing that we live in an actual imperialist economy, right, with actual forms of colonization. And so what we need is actually an anti-colonial curriculum that is able to describe how that world works and open up possibilities for resisting it because it is immoral and unjust and should be unacceptable to civilized society. So yeah, I mean, we actually need processes of real material decolonization of lands and bodies in the global South. And the question becomes for us, I think, what role do we play in that movement? And this is something that every student should and progressive should confront, I think. But I'd love to hear what Rob has to say about this as well, as he's involved in such things.
Should I go?
Yes, please.
So I really want to build on what Jason says. And actually, look, so one thing, look, so the first thing is Jason said, like, decolonization, not a metaphor. I agree with that. Although I also have formulated what I call Rob's law, which is like, when someone invokes that, the likelihood is in about 10 seconds they are going to use decolonization as a metaphor, almost inevitably. I think it's an iron law of like whatever, that is what happens. Decolonization is not a metaphor. Let's decolonize this. What? That's not decolonizing. But fine. But I think one thing to really point about the curriculum, right? And I think this is an important thing. Decolonizing the curriculum as a broad idea, I think, is hugely important in terms of developing an anti-colonial, an anti-racist, and anti-imperialist curriculum. We should be careful about the fact that university managements have co-opted decolonizing the curriculum incredibly quickly. Like, they are making that part of their, like, whatever packages, and they're doing, and that should make us wary about what that means. And in particular, to then go back to what Jason is saying, I can just tell us something very concrete about decolonizing the curriculum. Go and see how much your university is invested in producing research for arms companies. Go and see how much your university is involved in doing things which support the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and go and see the ways in which the material existence of our working and learning conditions are imbricated directly in forms of disenfranchisement, dispossession, and violence towards the global South. And that is part of the work of decolonizing the curriculum too, which people very often forget. Now, I think another really important thing, like Jason has a great line in the book, and I think it's a kind of an implicit theory running through it, but I think it's really important. You have a line when you talk about productivity and comparative advantage. And essentially what you say is, like, if you believe in comparative advantage theory, then you basically believe, like, Black people are forever doomed to be manual workers. And this is exactly right. So the point is that insofar as you have a naturalized myth of poverty, be aware that that is reliant on forms of racialization and racism. Like, very directly, that is what undergirds these myths and basically gives them a kind of a broader persuasive power. So I think that what's really important, right, is that this myth making is also about challenging racism, deconstructing racism, and attacking racism in that way, and understanding that what look like technocratic or neutral languages about the naturalization of poverty are actually politically salient questions about race and racism, and about who gets what and who is entitled to do what. So I mean, I basically essentially really agree. But with my proviso with decolonizing the curriculum is always, I'm like, I prefer the term anti-colonial curriculum, but I'm also like, we have to think about this. It's a slogan which has been co-opted, and we have to think seriously about what that means for what we do with it.
I guess following on from that, I'd just like to, one of the questions that we had was about, thinking in that section of the book where you have from colonialism to the coup, what kind of conditions that were present in that time, are we seeing them in any way in contemporary world? And do you think that, if there are any kind of lessons to be learned from that time, what it does offer us in terms of producing an equitable future? Are these conditions here in any way? And do you see the way in which that kind of myth making can be destroyed in a way that supports those kind of movements happening in the next 10 to 20 years, how long we have until things go even more wrong than they are?
Yeah, it's interesting. Look, I think that the first thing to recognize is that the process of coup making has definitely not stopped. I mean, the most aggressive period was in direct response to the progressive movement in the South, but it's continued. I mean, the invasion of Iraq we should see this as part of this, actually. So too with I mean, the invasion of Afghanistan back in the 80s, right, was also the intervention of Afghanistan was also directed at toppling a socialist government. But I mean, in Haiti, recent coup attempts in Venezuela, et cetera, like this process has really not stopped. At the same time, I think it is more difficult in the sense of, look, we don't have the Cold War rhetoric with us in the same way. It's not easy just to paint a progressive movement in the South as a stooge of the USSR, which is what Western media did so effectively in the 60s and 70s. I mean, of course, it does happen in some respects. I mean, look at the discourse around Chavez, for example, during his time, and even around Morales and so on. But it's a little bit, it doesn't stick in quite the same way. Okay, and I think that's in our favor. The second thing is that media is a little bit less unilateral, and so there's more space because of social media. I mean, at least one might hope to push counter discourses out there, especially to the extent that we have much greater access to Southern voices and Southern analysis. So that's also really crucial to sort of preventing the kind of mythology that can enable aggressive interventions against progressive movements in the South. That's hopeful, but yeah, I don't want to be sort of dewy-eyed about the possibilities. I do think that there are real options ahead of us in terms of potential use of MMT as a tool of decolonization, of unilateral decolonization, and economic sovereignty. It remains to be seen to what extent that will be used. I think it's possible that some progressive governments in the South might try it, and it could be successful. But let's see. But yeah, I mean, look, in terms of things that people can do, this is always a question that I get. What can I do? Like the aid industry absorbs so much energy and money and love from students in the global North who want to help, and don't know any other way besides sort of giving charity, right? Like this is like a tremendous amount of our capacity is channeled through that medium, and we have to stop that. And I think the key thing to do is, in addition to learning what Global South scholars are saying about the imperial world economy, is also to unite with existing progressive movements and anti-colonial struggles toward that end, right? So for example, and look, these are alive and well, right? Like maybe like at the level of nation states, they might be few. At the level of civil society, there are many. La Via Campesina is an incredible movement of peasant farmers around the world. They have hundreds of millions of members. Look at the Cochabamba statements, the People's Agreement of Cochabamba, which is a climate document written in 2010 in Cochabamba, signed by thousands of social movements across the South. Read that document. It is a direct demand for decolonization. Decolonize the atmosphere that you've stolen from us. Decolonize our resources that you're plundering for excess consumption in the North, et cetera, for capital accumulation and so on. This is a clear-eyed call for decolonization expressed in the 21st century, framed around the climate and ecological crisis. There's no question that we should be uniting with, working alongside, and supporting the organizations that are behind that. That is the face of the anti-colonial movement today. There's so much potential there. It's just that we're not having that conversation. Like when was the last time you heard environmentalists in the global North talk about climate breakdown as a problem of imperialism? It doesn't happen, right? Very rarely. It's that discourse is absent from Extinction Rebellion. It's absent from Fridays for Future. In the global North, we talk about ecological breakdown as a problem of technology. In the global South, they clearly recognize it as a problem of colonization, and they call for an anti-colonial struggle and response. To the extent that we are all occupied with the ecological crisis, this should be our lens. Those should be our people. Those are our comrades, and so I think that's a shift we must take.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll just give Rob the opportunity to come in because we've got just about 5 more minutes. And we've had a kind of related question, I think, to what Jason was just saying, around how a kind of degrowth agenda is related to or opposed to supposedly progressive approaches that make claims around alternative growth for things like automation and technological fixes for the climate crisis. So yeah, Rob, anything you wanted to add on that?
I mean, I very much agree with Jason, and I think in general, actually, there is a thing to say that the lens of the climate crisis, at least in some ways at this point, lends it to a possible struggle around that lens, which feels like it might be something that you could make those kind of interventions in, especially because of the kind of rhetoric about international coordination, the kind of way it's in the headlines, and also the very visible effects in places like the global South. It seems like there's at least space to try and make the argument, even if I agree I'm not automatically optimistic that it will happen. I think the other thing about the climate crisis, where it's at least a relatively effective argument that we can make, which I think works, is that there's such a compelling argument about the general connection between processes of capitalist accumulation and climate breakdown, that's an unavoidable lens. And once you start talking about that, it at least it's possible to bring in some of these other things in that kind of fashion. It's not perfect by any means, but like the amount of people that recognize that the Paris Climate Agreement is not worth the paper it's not even written on is enough people that there's at least something going on with that. I think Jason is best equipped to answer the degrowth question. I mean, I think what I would say, and Jason puts this very well in the book, actually, is that you've got to be really careful about what you actually mean by degrowth in any case, because of course I think specifically what at least some people advocate, which I would agree with, is it's like decentering the idea of something like GDP as the measure of progress, as your kind of unilateral only measure of progress. That doesn't necessarily mean, oh, you never do anything again. It means working out how you reallocate what you do in a kind of I would say like planned and rational way. That's why I think that degrowth needs a planned economy of some variety. One thing I wanted to raise, actually, Jason, and you don't have to answer in a lot of detail, but I'm really skeptical about MMT. And one of the reasons I'm really skeptical about MMT is that the states where it has the most weight happens to be the controller of the global currency. Whereas, yeah, if the US state wants to print some money, the US state's going to be fine, because what's going to happen to it? My question is, to what degree do you think, given integration into a wider economic context, any of the states in the global South, even collectively, have a degree of monetary sovereignty sufficient for MMT to really be that workable? That's one thing. And the other thing is, and I think this is an important part of the conversation, which comes up in the book, and I think we have to talk about, is you mentioned this a lot, and I think it's worth us talking a little bit about, is, of course, there are powerful interests in the global south itself who are integrated into global imperialist chains and who benefit from how this is and will themselves resist the devaluing of their assets, the removal of them from these sources and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, look, what's missing in all of our discussions so far is the fact that the global south is full of comprador elites, basically, who would resist the kind of progressive movements that we're calling for, and who actively do actually clamp down on the anti-colonial struggle that's happening in civil society. And we have to contend with that reality for sure. Briefly about MMT, yeah, I mean, look, there's no question that there's a spectrum of monetary sovereignty. So the USA obviously is kind of at the top. They get to print the dollar, the world's reserve currency. That's amazing. That's an incredible power that is basically, it underwrites their imperialism in many ways, their imperial privilege. In the global south, of course, you have a lot less monetary sovereignty, but to the extent that you control your own currency and can print it, and you cannot become insolvent in that currency, and you can use it to mobilize domestic resources and labor. And to the extent that we recognize, I mean, because that's what the power of currency is. Whoever controls the currency controls how labor and resources are allocated. To the extent that that can be used to reclaim resources from appropriation by the North, this can be very powerful as a tool of decolonization, recognizing that the limits on monetary sovereignty in the South basically have to do with their dependence on foreign finance and imports. If you can reduce your dependence on foreign finance and imports, you expand your monetary sovereignty considerably, and MMT can be used actually to do that. So it takes a kind of integrated approach. I'm in the process of writing about this now, so I'll have a more fully articulated arguments for people later. But in the meantime, definitely check out Fadel Kaboub, who is one of the best Southern thinkers on this right now. Briefly about degrowth. Who wants to open a can of worms with 5 minutes to go? This is a ridiculous idea. But let me just say, yeah, look, to the question, somebody suggests, does degrowth really challenge capitalism? Yes, it does, because degrowth is not just an elimination of the growth imperative. It is, we have to understand, degrowth is part of a broader movement for eco-socialism and anti-imperialism, right? That's where this terminology, that's where the idea comes from. It's not like a standalone term. It's like we recognize that rich countries have to reduce resources and energy use to get back within planetary boundaries, and after all, they're the ones driving ecological breakdown, and that just happens to require, I mean, this can be accomplished while meeting human needs at a high standard, by reorganizing the economy around provisioning and livelihoods rather than around capital accumulation and elite consumption. And that is what degrowth calls for. So we just have to recognize that degrowth is like a means to that end. It's part of a broader, it's part of a broader call for eco-socialism, and it's part of a broader call for anti-imperialism, to the extent that resource use in the global North, again, predominantly by corporations and the elite, is appropriated from the South. Degrowth is a call for ending those patterns of appropriation. And this is why, and we see this actually in the Cochabamba statements. It doesn't use the word degrowth, because this is before degrowth was really a word, but the principles are there. Degrowth principles are clearly there. It is a demand from the global South of the global North as part of an anti-colonial position. And so I think that's how we have to recognize it. And it's really like a conversation, it's exploded into like this kind of broad public conversation, and it's full of misunderstandings, but really was sort of intended to be a conversation within progressive circles about the extent to which post-capitalist society should pursue growth or not. And our argument is that it should not, given the ecological crisis, and given that we can meet human needs at a high standard with a lot less resources and labor than and energy than we presently use in rich nations. So, look, it's a big topic. My other book is about this, and so if you're interested, I would encourage you to take a look, and I'd be glad to chat with people about it in the wake of that.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this evening. I feel like there are so many threads from this discussion that could go in many, many different directions and fill many more hours of discussion. But thank you so much to everybody who joined us tonight. And thank you, of course, to our brilliant speakers, Rob and Jason. Thanks also to our tech support, Chris and Elif, who you may not be able to see on your screens, but whose labour has made this evening possible. I'd just like to remind everybody, you can visit leftbookclub.com if you want to become a member of the Left Book Club. You can subscribe to our newsletter on the website, and the link is also in the YouTube description. Follow Left Book Club on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook to keep up to date with events and projects, as well as promotions and giveaways. And finally, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel on the page that you're at now. Thank you all so much again, and I hope you have a brilliant evening.